The MTR West Island line to enter service late next month without the Sayingpun station. Police get ready to assist bailiffs in executing injunction orders. And details of the APEC summit in Beijing.
Good evening. The MTR West Island line is expected to open at the end of December, with the exception of the Sayingpun station. Stephanie Choi reports this news has been met with mixed reactions.
Good news for those who live, work, and go to school near the University of Hong Kong. It'll take you 7 minutes to get from Sheung to Kennedy Town by MTR trains on the West Island line, with the University of Hong Kong being the other station that will initially come into service. Trains are expected to start running along the new $15 billion railway line at the end of December. The MTR Corporation says it's all part of a backup plan to open the HKU and Kennedy Town stations first, leaving out the Sayingpun station.
We're now going through the final stages of preparation and approvals. Once we have done all that, we will announce an exact date for that opening using the backup plan. We would look to make this announcement of the exact date in early December.
Until the opening of the Sayingpun station in the first quarter of 2015, trains on the 3-kilometer West Island line will bypass that station. The MTR Corporation says ground conditions have made the completion of the Sayingpun station difficult. Fares on the West Island line will be calculated according to the distance-based fare structure. Meantime, Octopus card users can enjoy a pre-opening discount by tapping on special machines located near the Sayingpun station. Passengers can also get discounts on 6 minibus routes and 1 city bus route. The MTR Corporation's backup plan drew mixed reactions from Sayingpun residents and public transport drivers. Of course I'm disappointed, said this man. Taking the MTR would save me a lot of time getting to my workplace in North Point. He explained. Another resident said the delay doesn't matter because public transport in Sayingpun is convenient enough as it is. And a minibus driver we spoke to said he isn't worried about competition from the MTR. We take less time than the MTR to get from here to the Kowloon side, he said. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party said special machines that offer long-term discounts should be available at all 3 stations on the West Island line to make up for the delay in the opening of the Sayingpun station. Stephanie Choi, TVB News.
It's been 45 days since the Occupy movement kicked off, and there are still protesters camping out in Admiralty, Causeway Bay, and Mongkok. A new injunction is being sought by a tour bus company and a cross-border coach company to get demonstrators off a number of roads. Those roads include Connaught Road Central, Harcourt Road, and Cotton Tree Drive. The court will open the case on Monday. Meanwhile, the government stressed today that law and order must be maintained after the High Court granted extensions to injunction orders. Those orders bar protesters from taking up roads at 2 locations in Mongkok and in the area outside CITIC Tower in Admiralty. Diane To reports.
Despite the extension of the injunction orders, protesters were still camped out in the area outside CITIC Tower in Admiralty today. Some acknowledged the court ruling and insisted they weren't trying to challenge Hong Kong's rule of law. We only want to use civil disobedience as a way to fight laws that are unjust, said this demonstrator, adding that when the bailiff gets there, they will start clearing their items slowly to try and drag out the process. The acting chief executive emphasized this morning that the injunctions are solemn legal orders that must be obeyed.
With a view to protecting the due administration of justice and upholding the rule of law, the police will give full assistance, including making arrests where necessary, to enforcing the injunction orders in such ways as the courts instructs. So I call on those who are still unlawfully blocking the roads in Hong Kong to leave the occupied areas peacefully of their own accord.
Lam also stressed the government is determined to launch the second round of political reform consultation within this year. According to sources, the police will begin helping bailiffs carry out court orders on Thursday morning at the soonest, with 7,000 officers on standby to take action. Secretary for Justice Rimsky-Yoon said today the police are simply instructed to help bailiffs clear out obstacles in accordance with the court orders and not to take clearing action against protesters. He also pointed out that the injunctions will still be in effect even if an appeal is lodged. Civic Party legislator Alan Leung, who's also a barrister, called on protesters not to pillory those who decide to obey the court orders.
My advice to all those affected must be to obey the court order and act as directed. But I must also emphasize at the same time that there is much more to the rule of law as an institution than simply government making laws and the public obeying those laws. If that is the case, then the rule of law will simply be an institution allowing laws to be used as vehicles and instruments to rule.
Diane To, TVB News.
World leaders gathered today for the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in Beijing. The annual event is an opportunity for the 21 heads of state to maneuver for greater regional economic influence. But as James Aiken reports, this year's host has made the event about more than just business.
They were dressed to impress on Monday night. And then the leaders and their guests were treated to a lavish welcoming banquet that only the Chinese capital could stage. And what would an event of this magnitude be without eye-popping Beijing-style fireworks? This morning, it was time for the family photo, followed by a brief walk in the park for a ceremonial tree planting. And with the glamour and formalities completed, it was down to business for the leaders of the APEC member economies. Topping the agenda for host China this year is a regional free trade pact known as the Free Trade Area of the Asia-Pacific. This morning, President Xi Jinping took the lead in promoting the multinational trade agreement. He called APEC a big family and said that deeper integration will benefit all member countries. He called for speeding up efforts to establish the free trade zone and other efforts to promote business ties. Having reached consensus on starting that free trade zone, Xi told leaders it is now time to translate the consensus into action. Meanwhile, APEC business leaders have been grappling with how to take down barriers in overseas investment, particularly in emerging economies.
It's very difficult to invest other partner in APEC because so many difference and very difficult from traffic, from the trading and from the regulation in investment. It's really necessary to build a much more easy connectivity.
APEC's 21 economies account for 40% of the world's population and 44% of global trade. At the close of today's Leaders Summit, Xi Jinping promised that APEC members will work together with the United Nations to help African countries combat the Ebola epidemic. James Aiken, TVB News.
Guilty verdicts were handed down to the crew of the South Korean ferry disaster that killed more than 300 passengers last April. The ship's captain escaped the death penalty, but he was sentenced to 36 years in prison for negligence. The chief engineer got 30 years after being found guilty of homicide for not aiding two injured fellow crew members.
Prosecutors were hoping the Gwangju District Court would put Captain Lee Jun-seok to death. After all, video proved he and several of his crew purposely abandoned passengers as the seawall ferry was sinking. The court acquitted Lee of homicide, saying it believed Lee didn't know his action would lead to so many deaths. But the ship's chief engineer was found guilty of homicide for abandoning two injured colleagues. Park Ki-ho was slapped with a 30-year prison sentence. After fleeing the ferry, Park never alerted rescuers, even though he knew his shipmates would die without help. For their negligence, the 13 other crew received up to 20 years in prison. The crew are adamant they thought it was the Coast Guard's job to evacuate passengers. Only 172 of the ferry's 476 passengers and crew were rescued. Of the 304 confirmed dead or still missing, 250 were school children. Knowing the 15 convicted were the first to flee the ship will be a lifelong scar for those left childless as a result. Outside the court, still grieving families criticize the verdict as being too lenient. To ensure the punishment fits the crime, the families plan to send more evidence to the Court of Appeal. The overloaded seawall capsized on April 16th on a routine voyage from Incheon to the holiday island of Jeju. Just as the trial ended today, so too did the search for the missing. Citing safety concerns after 2 divers died looking for bodies, the families of the 9 passengers still unaccounted for requested calling off the underwater search. A tearful end to a terrible tragedy that remains one of the worst disasters in South Korean history.
A suicide bomber disguised as a student set off explosives at a high school in northern Nigeria on Monday, killing at least 48 people and wounding dozens of others. About 2,000 students had gathered for a weekly assembly at the college when the explosion ripped through the school hall. Survivors said the bomber hid the explosives in a type of backpack popular with students. It was the latest attack by suspected Boko Haram militants who kidnapped more than 200 schoolgirls earlier this year. Boko Haram has stepped up attacks since the Nigerian government announced a ceasefire agreement last month, as well as the imminent release of the kidnapped schoolgirls. Boko Haram's leader has denied there is a ceasefire. An Israeli woman and a soldier are dead after Palestinian stabbing attacks in Tel Aviv and the occupied West Bank. The Israeli police released security footage showing a Palestinian man ramming his car into a bus stop and hitting the woman, then returning to stab her. The attacks extend a surge of Arab unrest over access to a Jerusalem compound housing Islam's 3rd holiest site. Stone-throwing protests have also erupted in several Arab towns in Israel since Saturday, when police killed an Arab youth who assaulted them. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has promised a tough response. There has been no immediate comment on the stabbings from Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas.
And still ahead in our newscast, undesirable trade practices still exist in first-hand residential property sales. Hong Kong people's salt and sugar intakes found to be excessively high. And China's J-31 stealth fighter makes its public debut at the Zhuhai Air Show.
A creature stops itself in its tracks, seems to tear itself apart, and then rebuilds itself as a completely different kind of creature.
Metamorphosis. Is it a human experience?
The real change is in the way of life of the creature.
Tonight, Metamorphosis, the science of change, at 9:30 on Pearl Spectacular.
傷風感冒好返，龍痰仲未清。
幸福為你行多步，
食幸福化痰素，特有怪芬先
稀釋龍痰，啲痰鬆晒，先易啲咳出嚟㗎。幸福為你行多步。
Get ready for a new page in motorsport history. Welcome to Asia's most legendary race.